Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Orange Team podcast. Today, we're going to talk a bit about Linux, but don't worry, we're talking about it from the perspective of someone interested in getting started, and maybe a little bit about what Linux has to offer for you, whether you're a gamer or someone interested in setting up your own home server. This is the episode for you. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Orange Team podcast. I'm Mitch, he's Leighton, and today we have an appropriately sized amount to talk about.
An appropriately sized amount. That's fun. That's new.
We usually have a lot. Today we have an appropriately portioned amount.
This is doctor approved amounts.
Yes, it's like based on a 2,000 calorie diet. This is how much you need in your podcast daily serving.
Okay, so don't any more than that, and you're gonna get into some health issues. So we're definitely experts and recommend that you follow our advice.
100%. Well, Leighton, what have you been up to lately?
What have I been up to lately? This and that and this. But no, as far as things of note, I like to talk about like different games and media that I'm into. And I just recently picked up the new Paper Mario game, Thousand Year Door, which is the remake of the 2004 game for GameCube, which I never got to play. Being the Nintendo nerd that I am, I just had to pick it up and find out what all the hype's about.
The hubbub, if you will.
The hubbub, absolutely. And it's an RPG, which is something that I enjoy, but I'm not like, it's not my first choice in games, and I'm very much enjoying it. So not too much to say on that. I've only just started, so but I'm enjoying it. It's a fun game that the kids can watch, and I do think it's very well made.
Well, that's awesome. Like, I've never played any of the Paper Marios. I did play Super Mario 64, Super Mario RPG on the Nintendo 64, like Legend of the Seven Stars or whatever. Mm-hmm. That Square Enix one. And then I played Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga, which was awesome.
That is
on the Game Boy Advance. Yeah, legendary. The idea of adding a kind of an active component to a turn-based battle is something, I think that was kind of ahead of its time at the time, was it not?
Yeah, I think...
I don't remember.
Nintendo started that with the Super Mario RPG, the Seven Stars one, and then continued it in basically every RPG following. The Paper Mario series, the Mario and Luigi series, which, yeah, absolutely. Actually, if you like the Mario and Luigi series, you would really like Paper Mario Thousand Year Door. It's very similar as far as the way it plays out, and the humor and the storytelling.
Yeah, that's the impression I've gotten, which is why I kind of mentioned them side by side. It's just, for whatever reason, I never was in a place to play them. Like, maybe I even had the consoles, but it was like, if you're going to the store and your mom says you can pick up one game for your GameCube and you want Smash Brothers or something, you're probably going to ask for Smash Brothers as opposed to Paper Mario or what have you.
Exactly. And, to be fair, as much of a Nintendo fan as I am, I have not played too many of the Paper Mario games either. So this one was it's just a lot of people hype this one as the best one in the series. And I never had a GameCube growing up, so I never got a chance to play it. But now I have the opportunity, so I'm kind of excited to kind of see what it's all about, but in a very polished, refined way, like getting really kind of the best of it now. I mean, the graphics, for being on Switch, obviously it has its limitations, but they've done Nintendo excels at art design, and my goodness, this game is just busting with polish and charm, and just, I think bursting, maybe the best choice of word.
And oodles of charm.
Oodles and oodles. It's very pretty. I like looking at it.
Yeah. So you're getting to play the definitive edition, basically, of Thousand Year Door.
That's kind of my MO, it seems like. I'm late to the party on so many games, and then like the definitive edition comes out, and I'm like, I guess I'll play it now. And it's like, this game's amazing.
Totally. I kind of feel that way myself. I'm getting back into Destiny 2 lately, and by lately I mean over the weekend, because they're as of recording this, they're about to launch the final expansion for Destiny 2, which is called The Final Shape. I talk a lot about Halo and about Bungie when it comes to game development, and the game that kind of influenced me most growing up Well, Destiny 2 was Bungie's next. Well, Destiny as a series was Bungie's next game after Halo. And they wanted to do something different. And I'm elucidating here just for those who aren't familiar with Destiny. I know you know the story for the most part, but they went and made Destiny, which was sort of an MMO FPS. It was meant to be a first-person shooter in a shared world space that players could team up together and take down bosses and do raids, just like you might do in World of Warcraft or whatever else. But the time has come, almost a decade down the road. It'll be 10 years in September, I believe, since Destiny 1 released. And it is now time to wrap up what they're calling the Light and Darkness saga, which is kind of a weird feeling because I remember very well when Destiny 1 came out, and Matt and I picked it up and decided we were going to play through it, as we've done with every other Bungie game and so many other games besides. And so there were seasons of life, especially back then, where that's what we did every night, is we'd group up in a fire team and take on some strikes or just cruise around and do the main story missions together. And it was awesome. And it's kind of just fallen by the wayside. There's expansions I've missed along the way for Destiny 2. I think I was good up through like Shadowkeep. I didn't really complete. And then Beyond Light, I only got into it the very tail end of it. And then I did all the Witch Queen, the core Witch Queen content, and then I skipped Lightfall. But over the weekend they were having a sale on Lightfall, and whether I wanted to or not, I'm stepping into a war with the Cabal on Mars, as Zavala would say. But when Lightfall's on sale and it's time to pre-order the Final Shape and the final expansion called the Final Shape, you kind of can't help but do it. And so I'm all set up and trying to reorient myself in the game and get my gear set up for this final chapter. And I'm trying to talk Matt. I almost called him Moose. I'm trying to talk Matt into rejoining me. But I mean, we're all at a really different place in life, and you got our own things going on. So one way or the other, my Guardian's going to see it through to the bitter end. And it's honestly kind of exciting, getting back into it and seeing the hints at what Bungie has lined up with the trailers they've released. And one just came out today, so that'll date the podcast. This is the day that the Destiny 2 Final Shape launch trailer released. So yeah, I'm super stoked. And so pretty much after work every day I've been just playing that, or over the weekend, and that's a game my son and I can play together. I have personally decided that, especially with public chat and whatnot off, Destiny is at least an acceptable game for he and I to be in a fire team together and go run through. So he was super excited to see me playing again and to get set up himself.
That's awesome.
And yeah, so we'll see what comes of it. Destiny 2, the Final Shape, launches June 3rd, I believe. So if the podcast becomes wildly late after that date, you know what happened. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, because I'm the one editing.
I'm sorry for you. Yeah, no, that was directed at you, not our listeners.
Well, I like.
I'm sorry to them too, though.
No, it's interesting to getting the whole story right, like this, and it's has been quite a saga. Seeing. I mean, and as someone who didn't follow Destiny, but has seen Bungie go from Halo to Destiny, and now, isn't there? I'm sorry for being ignorant, but isn't there a new game they're supposedly working on?
There is. So they are working on a looter shooter, which is a reboot of an older intellectual property of theirs called Marathon, and so. Very, very few details are out in the wild about Marathon at present, but the implication is that it's going to be 3-man squads or up to 3-man squads going into an area, trying to secure some sort of resource and then get out without getting killed by the other human teams. Which is, just the looter shooter genre 101. So it's not like I have anything figured out that's special or that anyone else couldn't figure out just by reading the genre name. But on the topic of looter shooters, I've mentioned Hunt Showdown in the past as a game I've been enjoying. That is a looter shooter where you go in with up to 2 of your buddies. You got to kill the supernatural monsters and collect their bounties and then get out, and the other human players are trying to kill you to take the bounty for themselves. So it'll be interesting to see Bungie's take on that genre. It's kind of an underserved genre, which sounds weird. I mean, it's almost a subgenre of battle royale. It's like a little more focused battle royale where the focus isn't on just who survives to be number one, but like there's an objective to do. It's possible to get in, do the objective, and get out without ever engaging another human player, although it's unlikely. But it adds a twist that makes maybe the stereotypical battle royale formula more interesting and more diverse and fun and just engaging. And so I like Hunt Showdown. Escape from Tarkov is another example of a looter shooter. And
I thought they called it like an extraction shooter or something.
Extraction shooter. You know what? And I may be misspeaking wildly now that you mention it. Looter shooter might be more like Borderlands, or like Destiny is a looter shooter where you're grinding gear by rerunning like the same levels to get better and better drops. I may have misspoken that entire time. I think you're right. I think it is an extraction shooter, as is Hunt.
The only thing I know about Tarkov is is from watching Linus Tech Tips and Luke's take on it, and I guess which pointed me to a couple like documentaries about it, but otherwise I don't. It's an interesting genre.
You're right. Wow, I misspoke that whole time. Look at me go.
That's okay.
An extraction shooter.
We learn, we grow.
I'm really excited because I really like the aesthetic, like because Marathon kind of is the granddaddy of Halo in the same way that like for id Software, Wolfenstein 3D is the granddaddy of Doom. Like you can see how one led to the other, and for Bungie, Marathon was kind of that's where they learned how to tell the sorts of stories they wanted to tell, where it was a shooter, sure, but it's a deep world with a lot of different characters doing very complex things that if you dig just a little bit, you may find yourself more interested in the story than in the gunplay itself, which is, granted, Bungie also does some of the best gunplay in the industry, and that's what's carried Destiny all the way through its 10-year life cycle. Is whatever you think about the game, the story, the levels, etc., everybody walks away from Destiny saying those are the best feeling guns in any game ever, and they just have hundreds of them. So it's interesting to see them coming back in a sense full circle to Marathon and giving it a new fresh coat of paint and a new breath of life, and I'm really excited to see how they make that into their follow-up to what Destiny has been.
Yeah, that would be. I mean, anything Bungie gets into, it's always fascinating because they've made quite a few hits over the years. So it's kind of like the I don't know. There's a few studios like that where whenever they delve into something different or new, you're always like, what are they going to do with it? How are they going to handle it? And usually there's a level of polish and production value there that some studios may not apply. So it will be very fascinating to see what they do.
Yeah. Bungie's one of those studios that, regardless of what I have said in the past or will say in the future, it's sort of like I'll always play a Bungie game. Even if I'm disappointed or frustrated or whatever, like I'll come back around to it. It's just almost impossible not to.
Yeah. Well, they built your childhood.
But they really did. Like they're, as we've discussed before, like I am in the position I am in life now because of Bungie, because of wanting to work at Bungie is why I've learned what I've learned and gotten the jobs that I've gotten. And obviously I, sort of shoot for the stars or shoot for the moon and you'll land among the stars, right? Like obviously I didn't end up working at Bungie. But I have gotten to work in the games industry, and I am a software developer now, and it's like I really do have them to owe for that inspiration, that drive.
That's awesome. That's inspiring. I mean, I think we all have different, I don't know, people that we follow and like different inspirations that even though we're not where we thought we'd be, like they're still there and they're still doing their thing, and we're still inspired by them. I'm inspired by like
Well,
people like Corridor, and I follow Nintendo and stuff, and I still keep up with that. And I don't know. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I mean, some people inspire us, and that pushes us to take action. Some people wildly, unequivocally, and repeatedly disappoint us, and that can also push us to take action. Like Microsoft. I don't know that I have. I'm trying to think of the way to put this. I don't think they've done anything good since like Windows 7. Like, and I like. Yeah, I think I'll just say that. Like, the last good thing they did was 7, I think. And that's obviously I still have Windows computers in my home, like one has to some degree. But they crossed a line at some point in the last year or two where I and many others have decided, hey, the less Windows the better, and a windowless future is within reach, so let's find it. We were talking a bit before the podcast, and you mentioned being kind of arriving in the same boat recently. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, my last major Windows experience was with Windows 10, which I will admit, like, I think, and maybe my feeling with this was just because it came on the heels of Windows 8 and 8.1. So Windows 10 just felt like it was a good operating system by comparison. So I didn't have a huge amount of issues with Windows 10, but Windows 10 started getting very invasive with the type of stuff it kept adding that I didn't want, and I had to keep finding ways to disable it. And then every time a new update came in, those things would get re-enabled. And then Windows 11 came along, and I avoided updating for the longest time. I mean, I think I was 2, maybe 3 years in before I finally said, I'll give it a chance now because it's been out for a while and I know people who have it. And I did it, and I kind of regret it because it didn't really do anything for me. And it just seems like they're just constantly adding more and more things that just take away from your autonomy as someone who's using a computer. It's all now like they're trying to push for cloud, they're trying to push for AI, they're trying to push for just a lot less on device, a lot more in the cloud type systems. Like we're kind of going in a weird direction. I've said this to many people before, but like back when computers first started, they were the mainframe, right? No one had a personal computer, but you had the mainframe. And everyone had to go there, and it was this building-sized computer. And then slowly, computers got smaller and smaller and smaller, and everything could run on device. But then suddenly, we wanted more, and the company said, "Well, we've got this thing called the cloud, and the cloud is where you can store things, and the cloud is where you can run things on machines way more powerful than what you have." And it feels almost like our devices are less and less our own now, and more of a portal back to a mainframe. We're basically just connecting into a mainframe again. Only, now it's just called, a cloud, and they're like, well, it can do way more than the mainframe. But I don't like the idea that I can't just run things at home. I like that, and I think we still have potential for more. But I don't know. It's and a lot of it's personal, right? For me, I like to do things locally. I don't have the best internet. The idea behind a lot of these ideas is that, oh yeah, you can do everything over the internet. Well, that's great for people that have fiber. Not great for people like me that 100 to 150 megabits is about as good as it gets sometimes here at my office. At home, I might be able to get a bit more, but I have to pay $80 to $100 a month just to have access to these services. So and then they have data caps too, right? So it's like great. So yeah, I don't know. It's multifaceted, this whole exit from Windows. And now I'm on Mac, and that wasn't necessarily out of a hate for Windows. It was more out of necessity for my job because Macs just suit the type of work that I do, which is more video and graphic design. But I've also, now that I've been on Mac and I work with some more Linux type stuff, I've been realizing like, hey, like other than for games, I don't really have a need for Windows. Now, something you'd mentioned though, because I was saying to you like, oh, well, I still need to have a Windows machine so I can play games. But then you were like, well, do you? And so I'd be very curious to know a little bit more about like your solution to my Windows problem.
Well, totally. We'll run the gamut of the Linux experience, I think, in the next however many minutes we've got in the podcast. I did want to say one thing, though. You mentioned this push towards the cloud. um, we, never ascribe to malice what can be reasonably explained by ignorance, right? It's so easy to say, oh, it's part of a big grand conspiracy to make sure that you won't own anything. Um, it could have just been well intentioned because it sounds like a really good idea from like a systems administrator perspective. Like, hey, we'll give you a device that's essentially just a terminal back to home, and we'll keep everything updated and take care of all the infrastructure and uptime related business on our machine. Like, that sounds awesome if you're like a sysadmin or whatever. Or a software developer, you update in one place and it just is automatically pushed out to everyone, like for Google Drive or OneDrive. You're not downloading patches for it. That's all happening seamlessly behind the scenes. Like, that's really cool. But I think I've said this on the podcast before, but it's a quote I heard that helped contextualize everything for me. The cloud isn't some miraculous place. It's just someone else's computer. And that's really important to understand. Anytime anybody tries to talk to you about the cloud, what they're saying is, oh, well, yeah, that's stored in the cloud. That's stored on someone else's computer. You can run this software in the cloud. Well, you can run this software on someone else's computer. And for some people, that's okay. Like, maybe that's all you need. Like, the Chromebook is just one big cloud machine, one big cloud portal. And for certain applications, that's all you really need. But when things are running in the cloud, they're outside of your control. And for some people, that's okay. And for some people like me, and maybe for you, we're reaching a point where that's less okay. And we want to explore alternatives, even if it's simply about having that kind of control over these devices that we own, which the question becomes, do we really own them? I mean, software for decades now has been, the end user license agreement. You're not buying the software, you're buying a license to use it. And when the company decides it's convenient for them, they will take that license away. And one case study that people can look up that's happening right now is the lawsuit around the game called The Crew by Ubisoft, which they recently just flipped the switch off for and essentially revoked this game from however many paying customers. And it ended up going to court in the European Union. And I think that it's going to result in some new case law regarding how game studios are going to have to handle this moving forward. Do I think they should be forced to keep a game online? No. Do I think they should be forced to release the source code? Not necessarily. But obviously, I'm not happy with the idea that Gabe Newell could just flip a switch and turn my Steam account off, and he really could. Or more realistically, any one of the companies that develops the games I've bought on Steam could decide, hey, yeah, we're done, and just turn it off. So this line of thinking leads you down a path which results in open source software looking particularly interesting, because this is software that if you have the know-how, you could potentially, theoretically, even work on yourself or update or whatever yourself. But more accurately and more realistically to most people's use case, it's just software that's generally abiding by principles of free as in freedom, as defined by is it the New Software Foundation? There's a bunch of different foundations that are at work kind of trying to define what open source should be. They kind of have competing standards. Debian's got their own foundation. Canonical and Ubuntu, I think they have their own understanding of it. And then there's the really hardline Free Software Foundation. I'm going to look that up real quick, just in case people want to follow along at home. Free Software Foundation. But nonetheless, the Free Software Foundation, if it is the one I'm thinking of, it used to be run by Richard Stallman, who's used to be a big name in the movement. But the idea is free as in freedom. Not free as in no cost, which Linux also is, but it's about free as in the freedom to use your devices and your software the way you want to use them. Which, everyone's got a different relationship with their digital avatar, if you will, their digital life and digital sphere. But for me personally, I could use a little bit more free as in freedom. And that led me to pick up Linux. Now, when I picked up Linux, and especially once I installed it, I just slapped a new hard drive in, pulled my old Windows hard drive out, and installed it into my daily driver computer. I had to come to terms with the idea that there would be sacrifices, that I was going to incur a cost, whether that meant games I couldn't play or software I couldn't use. And that to some degree, someone had to be the first one in my group, my circle of people, to take that step. And I kind of wanted to take it first, A, because I thought it was a good idea, and B, because that way I could help others who wanted to follow along behind to kind of figure out where the stepping stones in the running river were, instead of having to find them blindly like I did. All of that being said, we're recording this, I'm recording this on my Mac, but right to the left of my Mac is my Linux box, and it's had Linux on it for 2+ years now, and I have not once needed to second guess that. The list of things I couldn't do, and this is out of the box, this is with very little extra work. The list of things I couldn't do or software I couldn't run on Linux, and I'm a pretty well-traveled gamer. I think there were 3 games that either didn't run or were better if I streamed them over Steam Link from my Windows machine. And so I just had my Windows machine running headless, sitting next to my Linux box. And for those games, which one of them I think was Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, I would stream it. And Steam Link ran with, latency as if I was sitting at that computer anyways. It was absolutely not impactful to the end user gaming experience. But for everything else, it just worked. Steam just worked. Now, could I use Photoshop? No. But for my purposes, not doing what you do, but just occasional photo touch up and whatnot, there's GIMP, which is a free and open source image editing software. Suffice it to say, there is an alternative to everything. There's an alternative for Microsoft Office in LibreOffice. There's an alternative to Adobe Audition, or not necessarily Audition, but I'm recording this podcast on Audacity, which is open source software available on Linux and Mac and Windows. Basically, there are alternatives to just about everything you use. And not only that, once you have this kind of control over your devices, you can start to consider things like setting up your own personal cloud, hosting your own cloud for your ability to back up files or quickly work on documents in the cloud, or what have you, VPN home, so you have a secure connection back to your home network from anywhere in the world. To access your own personal cloud, you have so much more control over your privacy settings, over the footprint you leave on the digital world around you. And all it takes is the gumption to take that first step.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think as things keep changing, right, with Microsoft and all these different companies, it's what is it, when the pain of staying the same is worse than the pain of change, is kind of where I feel like things are getting to now, where I'm at the point where it's it's either to your wallet, to your own personal feelings about the matter, whether it be privacy related or just ethics in general. Maybe you don't like a certain company, but for me, it's almost like I'm looking at it as a long-term financial decision. I kind of think of all I've very mildly jumped into this new ocean, and that's with the media server that I've created. And that is really just out of a desire to have more control over my media and to not be paying for all these subscription fees, because they're just constantly going up and they're never going to stop. It's just, most of these companies aren't even profitable, so they're going to have to raise their rates at some point. But then you start looking down the road and you're like, okay, well, my email, is all on Google, and they're starting to probe a little bit more into that and build all these ads and everything based around reading your emails. And then there's cloud storage, which is like, okay, as someone who has to contain, I have both, I'm like the keeper of the archives for my family, right? So I have these external hard drives, which work, and I've done a little bit of duplication to make sure I have them in different locations, but it's very convoluted. It's like, okay, I can pay absorbent amount of money per month to hold on to this information that, it's like terabytes worth of information. Or maybe I build my own server and then I have more control, maybe, heck, even more speed if I'm locally near it. So I don't know. I'm very fascinated by this subject and what you know, because it's something I personally am interested in diving into. Some of it more than others, just due to the financial implications of it. Like setting up my own cloud server is going to be a little bit pricier by the time, because you got to buy all the hard drives. But I still would like to have the knowledge, because I think it's something that down the road I'd like to do. But yeah, I think it's important that we, and like I like what you said too. Like it depends on, some people are okay with using the services that are out there, and that's okay too. We're not here to say don't use this company because they're evil. Don't use this because XYZ. Like if you have the money and you need that service, that's what it's there for. This is a free market. You use what's there. But I think this adds a level of competition to the market, and it just gives you that thought that, okay, if things changed, there is a way out. You're not stuck using, all my stuff has to be stuck on iCloud, or all my stuff has to be stuck on OneDrive, or all my stuff, insert here. Or I can't watch movies because the movie I want to watch, because it's not on any of the streaming services. It's like, I don't know. There is a way out, and obviously it does take some time. It does take some know-how, but I think that's half the fun. And some people may say otherwise, especially if you have zero technical knowledge. But I think there is an element of like you're learning something new, and I think the more you get into it, you also realize that it's not as scary as it seems. Especially some of the open source stuff, which yes, there's more tinkering than signing up for some of these services where they do everything for you, but a lot of the people who are making these open source software, they've made incredibly good interfaces, incredibly good, to the point where it feels like a professional, paid service. I mean,
well, consider Blender. Blender is now an industry standard.
Yeah.
And it is absolutely just an open source project.
Blender is the poster child for open source. Though there are definitely differences, because it's there's a term for the type of open source it is, because it is very well funded by big companies, which is what keeps it going. So while, yes, it is open source, I don't think it would have reached the levels it's at without certain companies pouring money in because of the need to make Blender work. But it has allowed the industry, the 3D industry to grow. So I think that's part of the investment is these companies like, hey, we're not just making this a free program because we're benevolent. It's also like the more people we can give a tool to help them learn the skills to enter our industry, so we can hire more people. It's the same thing that's going on with certain game engines, like Unity and Unreal. You can name some more, I'm sure, but like they're free to just download and start messing around with, which is a huge thing that for people to be able to get into it. And then, of course, if you make it and you get big, then of course, then there's some money involved. But the idea is that you didn't have to pay all this entry fee to learn. And I think that's awesome.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of open source too, is that there's very little other than having some form of hardware. Obviously, hardware isn't free, but just about everybody has a computer. And what's great about it too is the ability to repurpose old hardware, because some of the thing that happens with Windows and even Macs is they just kind of leave the old stuff in the dust, and I don't want to call it planned obsolescence, but there's a certain point where it just has a hard time running what's coming out now. There's new protocols, there's new just demand because of all the extra processes happening in the background now on these machines. Whereas you go into Linux, like you can turn a 8 to 10-year-old computer into a working machine again, even if it's just running some basic services, whether it be a media server or a network or storage server or whatever it is. I don't know. I've got Raspberry Pi devices that they don't have that much power, but they can run most of the stuff we're talking about, other than some of the games. So it doesn't take much. So yeah, I think it's cool too because it's also a good, almost like a recycling program. You're taking stuff that absolutely can still work, but just giving it new life and new purpose. So
that's like the best use case for Linux, honestly, is if you've got a laptop in your closet that's maybe 6 years old or something, and it was just starting to really chug. Pull off whatever files you need to save, and then just install a lightweight Linux distribution onto it. And to clarify, Linux distributions are kind of like flavors of Linux as an operating system. Now, Linux itself isn't the operating system. Linux is the kernel, like the beating heart that powers it. But people can come along and layer all these different components on top of that beating heart to make up a full body. And that full body is what we would call a Linux distribution. Ubuntu is a very popular Linux distribution. Debian is another popular Linux distribution. Linux Mint, and Pop OS, another very popular Linux distribution. So these different Linux distributions exist ideally to serve different parts of the market. You're able to find one that's kind of tuned to your level of comfort with Linux. Some of them are even designed to look like Windows or to look and feel and require very little user intervention. Some of them are by design something that you need to essentially compile from the raw code itself, like in order to install it, which is Gentoo Linux. But don't worry, like Gentoo Linux might be the stereotype, but there are several flavors, several distributions of Linux that anybody could sit down and install with no problem, and a relatively seamless experience. But all that being said, Leighton, you mentioned having some questions. I think that might be better to kind of guide the conversation, is like, yeah, just like ask me, describe to me your use case, and I'll see what answers I have.
I think a great place to start, let's just start at the basics. Like, let's just assume that I want to not run Windows as an operating system anymore. And you just mentioned different flavors of Linux. And you mentioned some are more advanced than others, and you mentioned a few names, but like maybe, let's just say, yeah, I want to have a desktop experience like Windows, but not Windows. What are some solutions to that where maybe it's the most user-friendly solutions, maybe good support? I don't know. I guess I want to make, like, I don't know. I don't want to like say, well, what are you using? But also, what are you using?
Yeah. So I'm using Linux Mint, and I arrived at that after quite a bit of research, which isn't to say like, oh, I've got it figured out. Like, it was just the right one for me. Linux Mint is what we call downstream from Ubuntu, which means that it's essentially as if the Ubuntu Linux distribution created by Canonical, people looked at that and said, hey, that's pretty great, but I want to tune my experience a little bit more from that. And they came downstream of Ubuntu and kind of reassembled their own distribution. So all of the people building software that targets Ubuntu as a distribution, all of that software tends to work on Linux Mint as well, which means that compatibility is well handled. Support is well handled for the same reason. Linux Mint has been doing better and better and better lately, and it's definitely, of all the Linux distributions, the one that seemed the most painless for me to install, and then once installed to get all of my software set up on, and then to use. It has been really just, like, they have their own app store that they just call the software manager, and so I can go on there like I'm going on right now. And if I wanted to look something up, like, oh, I'm going to be working on, or let's just say I wanted Spotify. I just type in Spotify, and it shows you the Spotify music client that I could download as either a system package or a flat pack. That might sound scary, system package or flat pack, but system package is basically just one-click install, one-click use. Flat pack is kind of a different way to install things so that they'll install pretty much across distributions the exact same way. It's one of several different competing technologies to solve that problem. But you don't really need to know that in order to enjoy your experience. If you just typed in Spotify and clicked install, you'd get Spotify, you'd get a little icon that showed up in your start menu, and you'd be able to log in and listen to Spotify right on your Linux box. So I recommend Ubuntu because it is going to be one of the best supported. But if I may be so bold, for reasons that would not become clear unless you had used Linux or thought about Linux or really looked into what matters in Linux and why, I would propose that you at least consider Linux Mint. Because I think that what they're doing in terms of ensuring that there is no, that Ubuntu doesn't become this oddly central pillar to the entire Linux community. They want there to be options and alternatives that are still just as well supported and what have you. I like the work they're doing, and I really enjoy my Linux Mint experience.
Yeah, because I, as someone who has some experience with Linux, but I don't know the right level to put myself at. It's not novice, doesn't know anything, but it's also not expert. Maybe amateur is the better term. Ubuntu's the household name of Linux to me. Right. It's kind of like when I want to try Linux, or I'm like, yeah, I think I'll play around with Linux. It's Ubuntu, because there's just so many other ones now, and it's partially just because I haven't dug a lot. But Ubuntu's kind of like the name that's floated to the top of most circles. So, but it is good to know that there are others that are very similar that use that. If you don't want to just stick with Ubuntu. And it's fairly easy to install, if I remember correctly. It's you partition part of the hard drive, you install it. I guess what you can do is just run it live and off like a thumb disk or I say CD. No one probably runs it off a CD anymore, but basically, and then from there you can install it onto the computer. Correct?
Well, yeah, and to be clear, I know some people in my life for whom if I started mentioning, you just got to partition the drive, like their eyes would glaze over, right? You don't even have to understand what that means. If you just let Linux Mint, like all you have to do is if you have either a blank hard drive, like it's an empty one you just bought from Best Buy, or if it's a hard drive that you've gotten all the data off of and you don't care about overwriting whatever else is on it, the default setup for Linux Mint, for Ubuntu, for Debian, for most of these Linux distributions is pretty much just click, 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 done. And it will reformat the drive as one big partition, and you don't need to understand what that means or even care about it. But if you wanted to, in the setup process, you could set up your partitions and have a C drive and a D drive and an E drive, and those are all actually the same physical hard drive, just different parts of them. And, that's something that you get that a lot of control over. You could do the same for Windows. Mm-hmm. And just like Windows, you could also just let it do its default thing and have just one big partition. Yeah. So it's not as scary as it sounds.
I think I brought up the partitioning mostly because in the past, when I've ever I've installed Linux, I'm usually doing it on a Windows machine, and I'm not really wanting to completely destroy the Windows portion of it, because if there's ever a reason to go back or a specific need, I just like having it there in my back pocket. So I just leave Windows there, but doesn't mean it's running. It's not doing anything. But yeah, I mean, and in the setup process, they tend to give you the option and show you, like, it didn't. I know with Ubuntu, usually it's just like a slider. You basically say, oh, how much of the hard drive do you want to give to one or the other, and it kind of does it all for you. So,
right, and because of the way that Windows can sort of fragment files or like orphan parts of them, typically once an operating system is installed and functioning within a given partition, you don't usually want to edit those partitions after the fact. That can cause problems. I have done that, and I know you've done that, and it's something you can do, but I would not advise it. I would very typically advise, if you're installing Linux for the first time, either do it onto a blank hard drive, an empty one that you just bought, or be ready to completely format and wipe the existing drive. Just because the risk is a little higher if you're resizing partitions after the fact, that something could go awry.
That's good to know.
But that is really indicative. I'm glad you bring that up. That's the Linux experience. Windows and even Apple, they try to create worlds where everything just works, but you don't really have control. Like, think about the design of the iPhone. There's a power button, there's a volume up and a volume down button, and then on the older iPhones there was a home button, and then there's like a mute and unmute switch. But that's all the control you get into this incredibly complex and sophisticated device. On your home computer, obviously you have a keyboard and you have a mouse. But even then, there's still things that if you try to do them, Windows will kind of tell you, hey, no, I'm not going to let you do that. With Linux, I could write out like 8 characters, and don't be scared by this, because you would have to be in a terminal and you'd have to know the exact command to enter and all this other nonsense. But I could write 8 characters and delete my computer out from under itself, to the point where when it finally crashed and then I tried to start it back up, the hard drive would be empty, because I just deleted the entire OS out from under itself with 8 characters. Like, and it would ask you, like, or that specific command, it wouldn't even ask you if you were sure. Like, it's like, oh, you know what you're doing. But in other times, Linux will say, hey, are you really sure you want to do this? Like, especially Linux Mint running the desktop environment, it'll be like, I'll do it if you want. I just want to make sure you know what you're doing. Like, sometimes you're entering a command and it'll literally say that, do you know what you're doing? And sometimes you have to type in, yes, I'm sure, or whatever, as your response. But that is the Linux world. Like, this is your computer. You can do whatever you want with it as a tool, up to and including things that could potentially damage it. But all of that spooky stuff aside, if all you're doing is browsing the web, going to Facebook, playing games, whatever, remoting into another computer, all that fun stuff, you're never even going to see that side of it. You don't need to see that side of it. All you need to know is that your computer is your computer, to do with as you will, and not to be told what you can do with it, as is the case. That was what finally drove me off of Windows, is I kept ignoring the upgrade to 11, upgrade to 11, upgrade to 11. And finally it told me, it didn't say you don't have to upgrade. It said, when or do you want to upgrade, now or later? And I realized that they were done letting me decide whether I wanted to upgrade to 11. And that was kind of when I decided to find an alternative. Don't get me wrong, for all of my high horse and Linux nonsense, I still have a Windows machine. I have to. If I'm going to be working in the games industry, I have to have a Windows build target to be able to test on and all of that fun stuff. But I have personally made the choice that I'm going to shift as much of my life as possible over into the Linux realm. And then, like I said, recording this on a Mac, like, I'm just making sure that Windows isn't my be all end all, for reasons, right? Yeah.
Now, I'm just going to play, I'm kind of role playing this, but also this is really me. I'm someone who's like, the only thing I need Windows for now, because I have a Mac, and obviously Mac is not the be-all solution, but it's, to me, it is Linux, well, it's Unix based, but still, point is that it's very similar, but and it does all the things I need to do. It's my digital prison box. But if I want to break free from Windows completely, the main thing that's holding me back right now is games. So I'm someone who wants to now, I've got a machine, I've installed, we'll just say Ubuntu for the sake of argument. But I want to play games. I've bought games on Steam. I have all these Steam games. Can I play those?
Yes. So this is where we all say, thank you, Gabe Newell, for putting so much research and development and time and money and effort into the Steam Deck. And the reason for that is that Gabe Newell looked down the road as he was, my head turned away from my mic for a second, so I'll start over. Gabe Newell looked down the road and said, I want to make this device that runs on Linux. Obviously, our business is games at Steam. Obviously, Linux is going to have to support games, and it doesn't yet, or at least it doesn't to the degree that we are satisfied with. So Valve has largely sponsored, initiated, shepherded, I don't know what phrase you want to use, but they've been instrumental in the development of something called Proton. So Proton is what we would call a compatibility layer. It is not so much an emulator as it is a way, if you consider Linux to be one language and Windows to be another, it is a real-time translator between the two. And it can interface between your Windows-based game and your Linux computer and translate everything in real time so quickly that you're able to play the game with the same performance as if you were playing it on Windows. And in fact, in some scenarios, well, maybe not with games via Proton. Well, you know what? Yes, I got a better frame rate on Elite Dangerous running it via Proton on Linux than I did on Windows. And there's a variety of tricks going on under the hood. We could talk about the switch into the Vulkan renderer as opposed to like DirectX 11 or whatnot. We could talk about the way they precompile shaders and do all sorts of really fun sorcery, like software sorcery to make it work. But the net result is 99% of games you play will run on Linux now and will run as good or better than they run on PC. Will there be problems? Yes. Are they few and far between and fairly innocuous? Also, yes. At least from my experience, I don't know if you know this, Leighton, and I don't know if our listeners know this, but I play a lot of games. I've been able to mainline Linux for years, and honestly, I think at this point I could even run Modern Warfare. Let me pull it up. The website that I use to kind of feel things out, like when I was first scouting and I said, is this going to work for me? There's a website called protondb.com. It's protondb.com. When you first launch into the site, it's going to look like it's designed for people who are using Steam Decks to see, hey, will this game run on the Steam Deck? And yes, it does that. But it also more broadly just determines, hey, does this game run via Proton with any reasonable measure of success? And so I can type in, one of the games you mentioned in the pre-podcast conversation was Red Dead Redemption. Now that's a fairly new game, and generally new games have unique requirements and things that make running it on Linux through a compatibility layer difficult. But if I go onto ProtonDB and I type in Red Dead Redemption 2, it's got a gold rating. Now, a gold rating obviously isn't ideal, but it's better than nothing. You can read through the reviews, and you can see what people it worked for, what distribution of Linux they were running, what settings they had, and this is all self-reported. I mean, it's prone to error, but you can use it to determine, hey, does that sound like my setup? Does that sound like my use case or whatever? And while I see some people reporting, hey, it's been struggling to run, I also see way, way, way more reviews of, hey, all you do is run it with the experimental branch of Proton or whatever, which is all just a setting right in Steam, which they'll step you through setting up, and it runs. Typically, realistically, the games that are going to struggle most with running on Linux are ones with a proprietary anti-cheat, because usually those proprietary anti-cheats are designed in such a way that they're very sensitive to any change in the environment that the game's running in, and they're going to basically need to be compatible with Linux in a way that a compatibility layer can't fix. But Valve has been using their influence to work with some of these developers of things like Easy Anti-Cheat or BattleEye or others to get them compatible with this Proton compatibility layer. And we're seeing even more and more of those games, those sorts of multiplayer, competitive, maybe MMO type games running on Steam via Proton. And it is a beautiful thing. Proton is kind of baked into Steam at this point. You don't have to have Steam to have Proton, I don't believe. I believe you could install it independently and try to run games with it, or at the very least, you could use software like Bottles or Wine, which Proton was originally based on, and you could use those to try and get software running that maybe isn't Linux native. But the good news, Leighton, is that for 99% of games, they all run on Linux now, and they run as good or better as on Windows. I was playing Overwatch 2 the other day, which required actually a couple different like weird abstraction layers, and it is what I would call a gold certified game, where it's like it runs, but it's kind of jank, and you're gonna have to but once it compiled all of its shaders and things, it ran smooth, and I was able to play Widowmaker, which is a harder class to play if you're on a computer that's not running very well. But yeah, Grand Theft Auto 5 Gold, Ark Survival Evolved has a native Linux client. Every Valve game is going to have a native Linux client nowadays. That includes Counter-Strike 2, by the way, for those of you who are competitive gamers. Fallout 4, Mountain Blade Bannerlord 2, Gold. Sid Meier's Civilization 6 runs native. You can just scroll through the list at protondb.com. Scroll through the list or search for your favorite games and see whether they work on Linux or not, or whether you're satisfied with the amount of support they have. And understand that this list is fluid and dynamic and changing daily as work gets done in this ecosystem.
So Gold, give some frame of reference, because I'm looking through the list now and I see a lot of Gold, which sounds great. Gold sounds like, oh, that's good, but I also saw this Platinum, which obviously tells me, okay, that's a step above Gold. So then, and native obviously being the best, right? If it's running native, it means it's obviously going to work. Platinum being just basically runs with virtually no issues. Gold, I'm assuming, and again, I don't have this in front of me, but like, where is Gold just one of those like your mileage may vary based on your setup kind of thing, or where would you classify Gold? Because most of the games I'm seeing are Gold, so I'm kind of like, okay, well, what should I expect then?
Bear in mind that the world we live in, even a native Linux client, that doesn't mean it's bug-free. That doesn't mean there's no issues whatsoever. So in my experience, native is just like, whoa, this runs and runs well, and I don't have to mess with Proton. Platinum is like, this runs as if it were made for Linux. I just have to toggle on Platinum. Gold is, this runs very well. There may be some small but persistent issues. One that I saw described, I was looking at, what game was I looking up the other night? Oh, it's a newer one. I think I might have been looking at like Destiny 2, or just seeing like, oh, could I install this on Linux? And if so, what would the experience be like? It wasn't Destiny. What was it? I was looking at Destiny. Long story short, imagine that it's like, oh, well, Baldur's Gate 3. That was the game I was looking up. And some of the reviews said, hey, the game runs fine in one particular conversation and in a reproducible way. There would be like some white noise over the dialogue, but you could still hear the dialogue and it didn't show up at any other point in the game. So it's like, hey, there's some sort of a weird issue that seems to be specific to the fact that you're running this on Linux, but it may be out of the way. You may never experience it. It's certainly not absolutely show-stopping. And the odds are high that you're going to just get a decent experience with this game. Silver is a step below that. There's kind of some more bugs that, again, depending on how much you like the game, it may be worth wading through. Bronze is sort of like, hey, it runs, but, I don't know. It's going to be you've got to really like the game. And then there's Borked, which is just like, it doesn't run. That being said, I know of some Borked games that people have reported, hey, it says it's borked, but I've tried running it and it runs okay, at least in my circumstance. So just because it's borked doesn't mean that it is beyond hope. And that's kind of the nature of Linux, especially right now, as a scene, as a subculture, as a ecosystem. It is growing at an exponential rate. Not just because of support from things like SteamOS and Gabe Newell and the Steam Deck and what have you, Valve's work, but I think that it was just about Linux's time to shine anyways, as far as an operating system and a genuine competitor to Windows and Mac in its own right. Like the stars are kind of aligning and people are kind of getting fed up with stuff. And, we've got a fairly tech savvy generation coming up now that while they do like things that just work and are simple and straightforward, maybe they're getting ready to explore, and you can watch a graph via Steam's hardware survey of Linux acceptance throughout the years. And you can just watch the line for all Linux distributions as a total share of the devices running Steam just climbing year over year over year over year over year over year. And more so even recently. So I think we're going to start seeing more industry level support for Linux. I think we're going to start seeing more Linux distributions that tailor to gamers like Manjaro. I think we're going to see more support for things like Proton that handle that abstraction and make your Windows games run relatively seamlessly right on Linux. And I think the future's bright, and you're not necessarily compromising anything, even if you're a gamer, to jump feet first into Linux anymore. It is a very different world, and at the very least, worth, like you said, putting a Linux distribution on a flash drive and trying it out in live USB mode.
It's quite impressive. It's come a long way from where it was back when I first started messing with it. I'm kind of one of those people where my experience is when I was younger and had a lot more free time, I used to dabble a lot more, then got married, had kids, and stuff happened in life, and I just kind of had this like gap in my experience. And now I'm playing catch up where I'm like, all right, where are we at? And this is kind of an interesting to see like the evolution of like, oh, you can, like, I'm looking at this list, I'm like, and it's not just like, I was thinking, oh, maybe it's just new games, right? You know, games that maybe they would put effort in, but no, I'm looking at games that are very old and they're listed as platinum, like as a playable. So I'm like, okay, this is cool. Like we're at a point now where I could legitimately just have a Linux machine and play games on it, which is amazing. So yeah, I think that part is covered. So now let's just dive into some other stuff that's a little less like desktop-y, right? Like now let's move away a little bit from like, okay, now I'm running this up. Now I want to have some server. I want to have a server, right? I want to run some stuff for me. So we've talked about personal cloud. We've talked about media. I've dabbled in media servers, but like some of the things you have listed are like VPNs, or, you know, maybe your own private DNS server, or, you know, email server, or I think we even talked about using our own private video conferencing server. I mean, the possibilities seem like if you can pay for that service from someone else, you can pretty much do that on your own. I mean,
correct.
I mean, even AI, like people are like, AI is the big thing, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, Microsoft and everybody's got AI, but it's like, you know, most of the big AI stuff I've seen, a lot of it's all open source. Like, I mean, like people using Midjourney and stuff like that's just for the picture side, but there's AI tools you can get open source. If for some reason AI is like your cup of tea, it's kind of crazy what you can still do even with that on your own machine. And if you're willing to put a bit of money in, you can build a pretty good rig that can run some pretty impressive stuff. So
when I was dabbling with Stable Diffusion, I did it all from Linux, and it was much, much more quick than going through the same process to set up for it on Windows. It's almost like it caters to terminal savvy audiences, or at least it did at that time. Maybe they have better tooling now to make it more graphical user interface based and whatnot.
I think at the end of the day, that in order to become more mainstream, that's where it has to go, because you know, command line's good, but it does require a lot more commitment from the end user to learn all the commands and understand what they're doing, because command line is one of those it's like you're kind of walking to a dark room blind. If you have the room memorized, it's not that big of a deal, but if you have no idea what's in that room, you are basically going to be bumping around not knowing what to do. So obviously having a graphical interface is like just turning the lights on a little bit. You still have to figure out what's around there, like an escape room, but it's a lot easier to see. But yeah, I think, you know, the sky's the limit. So if maybe we don't want to dive into every single one of those things, but like, what are a couple things that maybe you would either recommend or just think that are good, maybe services people might want to think about installing on their own, to have running on their own, that you would maybe recommend based on your personal experience and knowledge?
Yeah, totally. Well, and as you identified, like that might be an entire episode unto itself, is just the cloud side of it. Um, just getting set up with VPNs, like that is kind of more technical. But off the top of my head, if somebody asked me, "Hey, I'm ready to get rid of Google Drive. I'm ready to get rid of OneDrive, and do my own thing," what would I do? I would ask them to look at Nextcloud. So Nextcloud is one of several competing solutions for self-hosted cloud storage and like cloud tooling. They call themselves an open source content collaboration platform. But the thing is that this is going to require a little bit more know-how to get set up. I would recommend that my dad install Linux Mint. I might not necessarily recommend that he install Nextcloud. I might tell him, "Hey, I'll set up Nextcloud and you can use my instance of it." But if you're willing to take the jump into Nextcloud, you can set up essentially your own Google Drive, complete with the Google Docs and Google Slides and Google, like all the different tools, whether it's setting up a presentation, doing a doc, doing a spreadsheet, whatever. You'll have your own personally hosted version of Google Chat where you can invite your friends and family to create accounts on this Nextcloud, and then you can all have private chats together that are stored on your device and are not saved anywhere else. You can have file storage. So if you're working on something on your MacBook, and let's say you're out on vacation, you can VPN home, or depending on how you configure it, I recommend a VPN for security purposes. But let's say you VPN home, you can just drag and drop like you were working with Google Drive and drop your file there. And then when you get home from your main desktop, you log into your Nextcloud, which I remind you is running on hopefully your own server right at your feet. And you've got the file right there in your Nextcloud Drive files section. They've got support for things like photos, like organization of photos and categorization, tagging, etc. They've got calendars, a calendar app. They've got tasks and everything that you would need or that you would expect from an app like this. And it's all free for you to self-host. And so you can do it on what we would call bare metal, where it's just running on that computer. You can do it in what's called a Docker image, which is why I would recommend, if you have any interest in learning how to be a systems administrator, understand that that is an entire career path unto itself, a very, very exciting one, a lucrative one. But nonetheless, it is a career path. But if that's something you're interested in, learn Docker and learn how to spin things up in their own little containers so that they're self-contained and everything's all neat and tidy on the actual device itself. But if you just want to run this on a laptop you have in the closet that's not doing anything else in particular, that's perfectly fine. Besides Nextcloud, some of the other things I would recommend are, say, Wiki.js. So for me, when I'm doing writing, I like a place to have kind of a central like knowledge base repository as I'm kind of doing world building and things like that. So I'm running my own Wiki.js instance as kind of a personal wiki that I can go in and tie things together and kind of brainstorm ideas for fiction, what have you. And then what else would I recommend? I'm just using Samba. Like I'm not using Nextcloud right now. I had it set up, but we moved and different hardware got repurposed. So right now I'm just using Samba for sharing files between computers. So that is a protocol that allows you to specify a particular drive or directory on the server and say, "Hey, I want to broadcast this to any Mac or Windows or other Linux device on the network." And you can set up a username and password to connect to it, and then you'll just see it once you connect as a network connected drive that you can just drag and drop files to and from. It's all very seamless. It's all very easy to understand and to get set up and working. And most importantly, it's all yours with no middleman who is actually holding your data on your behalf.
That's the key right there.
That's the reason we do what we do. And that's, again, you said it earlier in the conversation. We're not saying that if you don't do this, then you're doing it wrong. We're not saying that, I have no illusions about the stereotypical Linux superiority complex. Like, I will tell you, I still have a Windows machine. But I think it's important for people to understand the compromises they're making. I think it's important for people to understand where their data is going and to be informed if they make those decisions. If they choose to engage with the cloud, I want them to understand that the data is not under their control, and they are likely, if something is free, it's said that you are the product being sold. And that may be a trade-off that's acceptable for some. But it's important to understand that trade-off does exist. That free things aren't necessarily free.
It's not even just free. It's if things are cheaper, sometimes what you're doing is it's being subsidized. So you might still be paying for something and still have some of that control loss or that privacy loss because, again, it's being subsidized by ads or by, again, being able to sift through your information and build a profile. And most people, I think some people have gotten used to that at a certain point. They're like, oh, it's okay. But again, and I don't think privacy is always the main reason. And to some degree it is, but I think a lot of it just comes down to, just feeling like you still have control. I think for me, the biggest thing is just seeing I'm paying for certain things and watching the prices slowly creep up. And I can't blame them too much because of inflation, but I also feel like there is an element of creep that I worry is going to, now it's acceptable, but in, 5-10 years, where's it going to be at? And am I going to be a slave to this subscription forever? Because that's and I'm going to continue to build out my digital library, and digital files are only getting bigger, videos and photos and everything. So I think that I look at it as like, well, I kind of want to be able to keep building my library, but I don't want to have to be reliant on my internet speeds. And actually, here's the thing that really set me off was I use a lot of OneDrive storage, and that's partially because I run a business and I do pay for business levels of it, and I take advantage of a lot of it, but it's not hard for me to upload my files, but my goodness, it is shockingly hard to download them. Which I just find really scary because it makes me feel like they are taking without giving back. And And it's not, like I said, it's not impossible. I was just surprised by certain speeds being throttled when I went to download large volumes of files. And, I had all these old videos I'd stored from when I was in high school that I wanted to share. And I was like, well, I don't want to download each one individually. I'm going to select them all and download them. And then it limited to like 3 megabits per second download, which is insane. To me, it's crazy. But I mean, if I download each file individually, it gave me faster speeds. But basically, it kind of tells me that it doesn't incentivize you to download all your files back. And I don't like that, because what if I do need a lot of files and I want to share them or I want to use them? So it's become a bit more like an archival tool for me, just out of necessity. But I feel like that's something I don't like, is that feeling of like, wait a minute, what if I think my files are safe, but then what if I can't get them back? Or what happens if somehow I couldn't pay my bill? Do my files just go away? Whereas if they're on a hard drive and I own that hard drive, it doesn't go away. Yeah, maybe I turn it off, or maybe I just can't upgrade it because for more storage, but those files still exist. So, and as someone who I love photos and videos, and I've become, like I said, the family historian. So I have photos from basically when we first got a digital camera, and actually I have old video that was film converted digitally that I now my plan is to go through all the old photos and videos and actually digitize them, and I want to keep all these things archived forever, but I don't want to be paying, I don't know, however much a month to store all the family archives. I kind of want to have it, and then when I want to access it, I can, but I don't be paying monthly just for it to sit on a hard drive somewhere else. Because what I'm paying for essentially isn't the storage. I'm paying for the bandwidth monthly. Is the idea that I might download those files. Therefore, they have to assume that I'm going to be uploading or downloading but it doesn't actually cost them that much to store all my files. They're building petabyte, or what's even above petabyte. They're building big storage. Storage is nothing to
Zottabyte.
Yeah, there's storage is nothing to these companies. It's the bandwidth that you're really paying for. That's what the subscription fee is really. I mean, it's kind of paying for the storage, but at the end of the day, it's the network cost of a potential, like how much they assume you may or may not pull from their servers. So, I just like the idea of having everything locally, having faster speeds, having instant access to it, and also just knowing that I'm not tied to a long-term subscription fee. I can, obviously I have to invest the upfront capital. And one thing I did learn from my media server experiment was that, yes, I am not paying for certain subscription fees, but my goodness, is it a rabbit hole where I spent a lot of money buying, different hard drives to store it all, different, drives to rip the media, different a device to actually play the media on my TV, because I have raw movies now, but not everything can handle the bandwidth. Like my smart TV doesn't have a fast enough network card to actually handle the bandwidth of a raw 4K Blu-ray movie. So
Right.
I need, and also it will actually compress, do its own version of compiling that video to a different format for that TV to even interpret. So I bought myself an NVIDIA Shield, which can basically take all the raw codecs from that file and give me the image I want to see. But that was a $200 device. And then the computer I bought was $160. And the hard drive I bought was a 5 terabyte hard drive. And then I bought a special remote so I could actually, control certain things. It's like, okay, I kind of, it's going to take a couple years maybe for me to recoup some of this. If I were to look at a subscription fee, maybe not, maybe a year or so, but it is nice to have that control and know that media is there always. There's no like, oh, we lost a license to this. Sorry, you don't have that movie anymore.
I mean, look at it this way. Some people have hobbies that cost them a ton of money and they don't ever make money back on it. Like, even if you're not making money back on it, you're saving yourself money. It has a dollar value attached to it.
Oh, yeah.
And as far as hobbies go, that's not bad at all.
Well, and that's the thing is I was having fun doing it, so I don't see it as a loss. I just want to be clear to some people, though, that like it's also a hobby that's kind of addictive, that once you get into it, you may find yourself spending maybe a bit more than you were just streaming it. But there's more than just, you have to think about it differently. You can't be like, this is just purely to save money. Like, and I probably will save money in the long run, because there's certain movies that, like, and obviously like prices go up on streaming services. And I'm not the kind of person that signs up for like 5 streaming services. I have like 1 or 2 that I'm paying for. And my goal is to cancel both of those. So, but at the same time, I'm like, I like the idea that I can rewatch all this content. I'm buying physical media now. So at the worst case, I have the physical discs now, which is surprisingly, like I said, hard to do now, and it's going to get harder and harder as time goes on. But it is a fun thing, and the benefit to me is also I get the full quality. The audio sounds better. There's no artifacting. Like Blu-ray videos just look better than streaming. I mean, even a 1080 Blu-ray on a 4K TV looks better than most of the 4K, half the 4K streams I'm looking at nowadays, just because it's such a high bitrate video. It's just so clean. I just happen to have a TV that also has some upscaling, and then NVIDIA Shield will do a bit of upscaling, so it does kind of also help. But at the end of the day, like a 1080 Blu-ray is already still so nice, and then if you get 4K, it's insane. Like I want to get like a huge projector and try it on them, but anyway,
Let's do it.
So I think that covers a lot. I think we can save some more for another time. This is probably one of our longest episodes we've done.
Yeah. And we've got like a whole nother episode's worth of content queued up if we really want to dig into all of the cloud options and self-hosting and all that fun stuff. But at the end of the day, I think the main takeaway I want to leave with people is this. Linux seems scary. Change is scary, and change requires trade-offs, and there's a cost involved. But it's not maybe what you've heard. It might even be exciting or a fun opportunity, something to try, even if nothing else than installing it onto a USB stick and running it in live USB mode just to poke around and see what all this hubbub is about. Definitely do that. It costs you very little other than time, and it's a lot of fun. It's fun to kind of learn more about what your computer's doing and how it's doing it, and just exploring and trying new things. It becomes so much more than just this passive portal into Facebook, right? It's kind of getting back to the roots of computing and how it all started. And there's a lot of beauty there. So I strongly encourage you, take a look around, see what you can find, because it might be better than you think.
I agree. Definitely give it a try. There's no harm in trying. Most of it's free, like we said. And also, there's a lot of tutorials out there. Free tutorials. YouTube's great, so it'll walk you through some of those things. I'll definitely be looking up some of that, or just having more fun talks with Mitch. So,
oh yeah.
Well, that about wraps it up. Thank you, everyone, for listening. We appreciate you. Hope you enjoyed this episode of the Orange Team podcast. And if you have any questions that you want answered, or if you just have any feedback, we'd love to hear it in the comments, or reach out to us on Facebook. If you like this, leave us a like, subscribe, or follow, or whatever platform you're on. This has been great. Mitch, any closing words?
Please do leave me a comment explaining why you actually use Arch Linux and why it's superior to any Debian-based distro. I'm looking forward to engaging with you on that conversation. But yeah, that's about it.
Oh yeah, well, let's see if we create any arguments in the comments. That'd be great. Anyway, so this has been great. I'm Leighton. He's Mitch. This is the Orange Team Podcast. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.